multi-platform, multi-publisher show that's here live tonight to talk with you guys about role-playing games, the industry, and other fun stuff. With us, as always, is good friend Richard Balsley. Good evening, Richard.
Hi.
We also have, from the Hill Country in Texas, we have Michael Varhola. Good evening, Michael.
Yeehaw.
And lastly, our guest host, coming from Orlando, Florida, is Mac McLaughlin. Good evening, Mac.
Hey, how are you? Thanks for having me on.
We are glad to have you here, sir. So thanks, everybody, for tuning in tonight. Just want to make sure that you guys remember you can always interact with us on Facebook and our Facebook event. You can also tweet us at DInfinityLive, and if you'd like to send us a good old-fashioned email, you can do so at dinfinitylive@gmail.com. We look forward to hearing from everyone. We also, one of our viewers gave us a question for last week, so we'll be answering that later in the show. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Mike. Mike, we just released a new product over at Skirmisher Publishing this week that I'm real happy about. It's an amazing book called Insults and Injuries. Let's talk about that for a minute and tell us what it's about, who wrote it, and so on.
It is a book by a friend of ours, one of our authors, Dr. Eric Lee, MD, who is with McGill University up in Ontario. And it is a 108-page book that puts into game terms just about every disease, injury, and medical disorder you can think of. You know, some years ago, somebody described our books like Experts and City Builder, as being useful and earnest. And that has sort of become a mandate for me as to what we wanted to publish. And Insults and Injuries is a useful and earnest guide to all sorts of medical maladies. It went up into the top 10 on DriveThruRPG.com's hottest small press list within 12 hours of us releasing it. And that was a week ago. And it is still in the top 10 on RPG.com's hottest small press. So it's a great book. It's not an expensive book. It's only $9.99 for anybody who's interested in it. So it's worth checking out if you want to put injuries or diseases. And you know, it's fun, I guess, to have made-up diseases like cackle fever and all of this foolishness in the game. But, you know, in real life, nobody has ever cringed because of cackle fever. In real life, it was the Black Plague that wiped out 3/4 of the people in Europe any number of times over the last millennia. So being able to put Black Plague into your game or actual infection or compound fractures is really a lot more frightening and plausible than what's in the fantasy game as it stands. And that's what Insults and Injuries is all about. So I recommend people check it out.
Yeah, and it's becoming quickly one of my favorite skirmisher books. Before that, it was City Builder. You know, sitting right up there on my shelf is City Builder, along with my Dungeon Master Guide and my Monster Manual and my Player's Handbook. I mean, it sits right there.
To have our books not just be books that people say, oh, wow, that's neat, or that's cool, or be the latest fanboy thing for a couple days. We want our books to be the ones that end up staying on the shelf next to the DMG. That is our goal.
Right, and I think it definitely does that. One of the interesting things that I found in it was there was actually some prestige classes as well that use some of the material from the book, which I really enjoyed. I'm kind of the crunchy bits guy. You know, I like feats and skills and cool things like that, defects, of course. So I really enjoyed that. The other comment I had on it, and Richard, maybe you can comment as well if you like, is that it seems to bring in some really interesting things for a DM to be able to do to players. Have you found yourself in the past using filth fever or the other fictional diseases that are made up in D&D? And if so, would you use the real thing as opposed to using something fake?
I've never used any of the diseases in that I've seen. I mean, even though I like one of my favorite settings for D&D has been the Mystara world, like, you know, and having a campaign set in the Kingdom of Karamikos. You know, having the swamp so close to the capital, I just never saw a use for it. I mean, even though like the yellow fever that they present is supposed to be kind of like malaria, never came up in my games, but this is actually a really good book because they're relatable things, and I think that's really what makes this book so good, is that the conditions are something that you can see people actually suffering in real life. Like, you just go down the store and see somebody with some of these conditions, and the impact that it has at the gaming table is therefore more visceral, because you have something that you can go, I know somebody that's either suffered from that, or I've seen enough in the news about that particular disease or injury that I can actually relate to the material, unlike the made-up diseases, which might fit the world but don't really come across as being practical in trying to conjure up that sense of dread that you would be looking for, that this book actually provides.
Yep.
And this is our Halloween episode, so we are talking about things that are scary and spooky and how to use horror in games. And I think having something like, tuberculosis or the White Plague, or, having the Black Plague, having these things in the game can bring that level of horror up. Yep. That I think just using Filth Fever or
Poe worked disease and illness into his stories, and he's a master of horror. Lovecraft had disease and illness. Robert W. Chambers, who many people may or may not be aware, is the creator of the yellow sign and the King in Yellow. Yellow was the color of disease, and that is why he chose the color yellow for his stories. So disease and horror are inextricably linked in the literary tradition that most of us are familiar with.
Yeah, and this book is really something we're proud of. We're going to have a link right below for anyone who'd like to pick it up. It's real easy to get. You can also find us on DriveThruRPG. Just search for Skirmisher Publishing. But along those lines, Mike, we're talking about horror. You brought up Poe. One of the old grand masters of horror, of course, is Lovecraft and his Cthulhu mythos. And we have Mac here because Mac is the author of Skirmisher Publishing's Cthulhu Live 3rd edition. So, Mike, I thought I'd give you a minute to talk about what Cthulhu Live is, and talk with Mac about Cthulhu.
Yeah. Well, I'll just preface my questions for Mac by saying that it bears mentioning Mac and I have actually known each other for a while. Mac and I go back 30 years. We were gaming together 30 years ago in a now non-existent country known as West Germany. And Mac, in fact, was the keeper, the game master, that ran the first Call of Cthulhu game I ever played in. So 30 years ago, I was playing Call of Cthulhu with Mac as the keeper around our dining room table in Munich, West Germany. And then 12 years ago, Mac and I did our first convention together. At that point, Cthulhu Live 2nd edition was out. That was published by Fantasy Flight Games. And we went to this great convention down in Virginia Beach, and just all the hell raisins we did there over 3 days is the subject of a show in and of itself. So I won't get into that right now. But I was just stunned by a number of things. One was how popular this game, Cthulhu Live, was. How people were really responding to it. And that Mac had this entire crew. We had like 20 people that were down there in costumes. They had this giant prop of a 12-foot tall deep one that actually had to be controlled with big rods, like a huge marionette, and it was controlled by like 3 people. So they were building this 12-foot tall puppet that had people inside it out on this loading dock at this convention center in Virginia Beach. And I said, oh my God, this is the most amazing game. I mean, I'd never seen a game like this. I'd played D&D for 20 years before that, but I'd never seen a game like Mac's Cthulhu Live. And from the day I saw that, I said, damn it, when Fantasy Flight gives up its option, when Mac's ready to revise this game and do a next edition of it, Skirmisher has got to be the one to publish this wonderful game. So about 5-6 years back, Mac flew from Florida up to D.C., and he sat down with me and we workshopped for 3 days straight to finish all the editing, layout, and design on the 3rd edition of Cthulhu Live. And this is it. And it's a great looking book. It's an incredibly popular live action role playing game. The only horror LARPs that eclipse what we're doing at all, that compete with us at all, or the White Wolf stuff. Other than that, we're the really the top of the industry with this game. So I've yacked enough. I'm just going to ask a couple of questions to Mac, and he can sort of take it, you know, and run with it. And I guess my question would be, Mac, what inspired you to create this game in the first place? What inspired you to make it? And once you talk through it a little bit, be thinking about how to talk about how difficult it may or may not have been to make the sense of horror compelling in this game, and what you needed to do to make that happen.
Well, I had gotten involved with the tabletop Call of Cthulhu pretty much from the beginning. I was very fortunate to have picked up the very first edition of Call of Cthulhu right when it came out.
That's what we played, first edition.
Yeah. I'm almost scared to try to calculate back exactly when that first came out. But no, I always loved Call of Cthulhu. That was one of my favorite role-playing games. I mean, obviously still put Dungeons & Dragons, Warhammer, a lot of the classics, Traveller, but always really had a fondness for Call of Cthulhu. When I was in college, I guess, began dabbling a little bit with a few live applications of this. Some of the guys we played with regularly, we started getting creative, putting a few things together around the campus, involving multiple sites around the campus, you know, the library, a couple of chemistry labs, some of the dorms, a few off-site locations. And that experience was very formulative in what we later developed into the more defined rule system of Cthulhu Live. That was pretty much a very simplistic scenario. It really wasn't bad. When I was I finally developed Cthulhu Live, the first edition, I guess it was 94, I guess it came out, and put it out originally through Chaosium, and you know, it was just, I guess the inspiration to actually do the Cthulhu Live, it was actually a friend of mine in Germany that I was talking to, who were gamers and did some kind of like foam LARP fighting, I guess, and was telling him about some of the things that I'd done in college with this live action Call of Cthulhu, and he said, and he was the one that was really kind of pushing me, you really ought to try to write this down, and started putting it together, started snowballing, and you know, when I was about halfway through it, I went ahead and started, you know, contacting Chaosium, telling them, hey, look, I'm working on this. Would you like me to send you the manuscript?
And just to interject, Cthulhu Live is in fact a licensed live-action version of Call of Cthulhu.
Correct. Yeah, it's I mean, you'll see a lot. I mean, for those that are familiar with the game, you'll see a lot of similarities with the tabletop. Some of the a lot of the terms, some of the mechanics are very similar, but obviously with certain changes and certain streamline elements going for the live-action experience.
So,
but yeah, but it was a lot of fun. And I'm sorry, go ahead, Mike.
No, I was just leading back to that question of the horror element. How tough has it been over the years since you started this to really make the horror come through and be palpable to people who are playing this, or can that just not be done?
It is challenging. I'll be honest. It is challenging to do it, and the majority of the events that I've run over the years were heavily convention based, and the challenge with that is that you sometimes never know exactly what location you're going to get till you get on site at a convention. There's certainly, I mean, again, they're generic event rooms, so it's not like they have a particularly old or creepy or gothic element to them for the most part. I mean,
right.
You can get the lights halfway dim. And plus, also, you're somewhat limited with what you can bring to a convention. So, definitely with the convention events, there had to be a lot more of a suspension of disbelief involved. What we always said, though, was that groups that actually had, organizations that have the luxury of having local groups, and their local play areas actually had a great advantage in that because they had a lot more control over the environment, a lot more control over the props. Yeah. If they did it basically right in their hometown, they could add a tremendous amount of physical props and locations that you don't necessarily have that much control of in a convention environment.
Yeah, and when people run this at home, I mean, some of the ways people have told me they've adapted scenarios, they'll actually take their entire house and use it as the venue for playing this game. It's not like when we're playing tabletop and we sit around the kitchen table and play for 4 or 8 hours. With this game, they're using every room in the house and the backyard and the basement and the attic to play it a lot of times, aren't they?
Yeah, very much so. And sometimes also they may use satellite locations. Some of the supplements that we've produced also include tips if you're going to use satellite locations. Again, like the library a few blocks away, a local cafe, a few other meeting places where some participants might actually be, leaving the one site and traveling to other locations where you may have non-player characters staged in advance, where you may have certain props hidden in advance. Like we used to sometimes, if we were going to have ancient books of evil that had to be discovered in the library, sometimes we'd actually go to the library that afternoon, put the books on the shelves, and actually insert our own cards in the card catalog. That was back in the old days when you actually had card catalogs.
Right.
And so the players would actually, start flipping through the card catalogs, find out what shelf the books are on, and kind of go from there.
That's pretty neat. Yeah, and I know that.
Remember, the card catalog is the Google of the old days.
But this is a very prop-driven game, isn't it? You're alluding to the tomes and other things. That's part of how you get that suspension of disbelief, isn't it? Because the tomes, if anything, are some of the coolest props I've ever seen that you've done.
Yeah. Cthulhu Live tends to be kind of prop-intensive, and that's both. That's been one of the things that a lot of people love about it, and it's also, of course, one of its challenges too. We have a lot of people that had were former White Wolf gamers that tried some of our events at conventions or locally with local game groups. Frequently, that was one of the comments they really had, is because in the White Wolf series, obviously, which is very successful, very established, great, very atmospheric, but they tend to be very light on the props, and there's a lot of personal costuming going on. But you'll have frequently index cards as your prop. I mean, index card with gun written on it, or an index card with Necronomicon written on, or they might have a novel with Necronomicon taped on the cover. Whereas most of the Cthulhu Live gamers tend to be a little obsessive about some of their prop building. And you're right, everybody loves a couple of good tomes, and they're a lot of work to put together. But the cool thing about them is once you build a few of them, you can keep using them game after game after game.
And that really ties in with the Lovecraft stuff anyway, doesn't it? The whole idea of the ancient tomes. Yeah, and I mean, conveniently, actually, I don't know how well this will show up in the light, but like, and some of those that are familiar with some of the books, some of the Cthulhu Live books have seen some of these. For example, this is a prop we made of the Necronomicon, which is it's a simulated leather-bound book, aged pages. The text is actually composed of various occult tomes that we downloaded offline. Some of the Necronomicon knockoff, tomes that some guys have written over the years and kind of to pass off as a real thing. Artwork inserted, sometimes from some of the Mythos books themselves. Sometimes And the nice thing about it is, the cool thing about it is, since a lot of the text is drawn from occult books or even Mythos-related tomes, it's great to actually work in the game. So, for example, at the Necronomicon, I mean, we've got about, there's about 20 or 30 spells in it. So, in a particular adventure, if they need a banishment, there's the freaking book. You need to find the banishment spell for that entity. That's pretty clever.
We've also done, we've got a couple foreign language tomes we made. We've done some in codes, which are great, which then it can be whatever you want it to be. Actually, one very, very cool event we did, we used Francis Barrett's The Magus, I guess, as a core source book in that, and that particular scenario required the players to actually recreate a ritual, and it was very, very elaborate because they were having to go through all these complex tables of hermetic correspondence and trying to figure out different astrological symbols and different angelic
Well, there you're talking about a real book, too. So
and they had to really recreate this. Yeah, and that was a really interesting game.
But that's what Lovecraft did. That's part of what made Lovecraft so compelling. You never knew what was real and what he had made up, and it sounds like you're really doing a lot of the same thing with that.
We try to find as many cases as we can what kind of resources that are out there already. Try to use them use them smart, try to work smarter instead of harder. But then, of course, also there's a other guys will make, of course, different statues. We've had, I used to spend way too much time going through just antique stores, hitting antique stores, flea markets.
Right.
Hey, here's a really cool little. Looks like it's from India. Looks like I can turn this into a scroll case. All kinds of crazy things you could find at those kind of flea markets and such.
I remember one day when I was walking around some of the little antique stores down by Karlstor in Munich when we were growing up. There was a lot of weird stuff in some of those stores. I remember one day I actually saw a silver chalice that looked like it was made from a silver skull. So you could really find some weird stuff. Presumably you still can. But, I think a lot of people who haven't traveled overseas don't realize just what a weird, arcane cult influence you can really find if you're looking for it in an old place like Europe, an old city like Prague or Munich.
Now, of course, one of the things also that we recommend in some of the books too. Now, and if I use some terms, I know some folks that aren't necessarily that familiar with the Cthulhu gaming, some of the gaming books may not be familiar with it. I've always been a big fan of the what's called the Delta Green setting, which is basically sort of modern government conspiracy, sort of like an X-Files meets Cthulhu, out by Pagan Publishing.
Right.
And we also did a Delta Green supplement for Cthulhu Live. I was always a big fan of that setting because, again, going back to the element of suspension of disbelief, it was a lot easier to do a setting in a modern day setting. Just simply, instead of having, this is supposed to be set in the 1920s, 1930s.
Cuts out the costuming to start with.
Exactly. Costumes, props, so on. Yeah.
And having the whole idea of a government agency that's dedicated to fighting the mythos, that isn't actually a modern concept at all. Lovecraft really postulated that in Shadow over Innsmouth, because doesn't the FBI and the Coast Guard come in at Shadow over Innsmouth and actually blow up the Deep One's redoubt at the end of that book?
Yep. Now, so it was. It's definitely, there's a very old precedent for it in Cthulhu mythos.
Yep.
So I've never actually been in a Cthulhu LARP, but I've done lots of the vampire LARPs. I did that for many, many years. But one thing I've noticed, especially down here in Houston, is that there are a lot of Cthulhu LARPs at conventions. Everyone that I've been to in the last 10 years has had a Cthulhu LARP. So, I don't know how things are in other places around the country, but based on what we see here in Houston, it's a very popular thing. Do you think that there is like pockets of regional pockets where it's more popular than others, Mac? And if it is more popular in other places, do you think it may be because of where it is? Like, for instance, deep South Texas, or Innsmouth in the Northeast.
I don't know if there's any specific regional pattern. I mean, over the years, there ended up being a couple of different production groups that really kind of latched onto the game, and some of the activities they did regionally and locally, of course, sometimes led to other gamers getting involved in it. I mean, in comparison to the Masquerade series or the White Wolf series, sure. I mean, it's a niche market of a niche market, but it has a lot of appeal. Again, some of the one of the challenges of it is, sure, it tends to be somewhat prop intensive. One of the advantages of it, and this is one thing that I always maintained, and this is something that converted a lot of the other horror gamers out there the first time they tried Call of Cthulhu, is that it kind of depends on how you're defining the term, but in many ways, the Call of Cthulhu game, that kind of experience, is maybe a little bit more of a truer horror experience than something like Masquerade, because essentially you're playing average humans. You're playing average humans with no supernatural powers, no special abilities.
Right.
You're actually confronted by ancient supernatural entities far and beyond your capabilities to handle one-on-one. Whereas in Masquerade, of course, it's very darkly romantic. There's a whole gothic element to it. But basically, you're playing supernatural entities, already right off the bat, and so there's it's very political, but there's certainly some, arguably there's some elements of the Cthulhu Lives that are maybe truer to a horror experience than some others.
Good deal. Well, Mac, we appreciate you coming on to talk about Cthulhu Live. It's a great game. We could talk about it for a couple hours, but obviously aren't able to. So we're going to move on to some other things and talk about some of your more recent ventures. I know you have your own airsoft company, Mind Game Productions. I know that you've got our big organizer of the U.S. Space Marine Corps, which is a live-action event that's run at cons and has some tabletop game that Skirmisher's working on. So I hope you'll stick around a little while longer and help us explore some of that as well.
Sure.
And Richard, you had a question relating to airsoft. Why don't we use that as a way to segue into Mac's Mind Game Productions?
Sure. I'm not really big into LARPing, and I'm more of the sit around the tabletop and throw some dice around and hang out with my friends, eat pizza, drink soda, whatever kind of stuff, right? So I was wondering, how do you use airsoft to make LARPing seem less nerdy? I mean, given that it has that association with it, that somehow it's more, I don't know, geeky than sitting around a table playing an RPG.
Well, airsoft, I first really got exposed to airsoft. Actually, it was also through Cthulhu Live. I had started to discover airsoft spring weapons, as I mentioned how prop intensive we were, and began to discover that, hey, these are the coolest looking props imaginable. And of course, early on we weren't actually shooting each other with them. We were just using them as non-firing props. But to kind of segue into answering that question, using airsoft and LARPs is kind of a double-edged sword. And that's one of the reasons also why the Masquerade tends to use like index cards instead of, that say gun, instead of a realistic-looking gun prop, is you've got to really have very solid control over the environment and a certain amount of control over the people themselves. You've got to just make sure that or at least try to minimize the idiot factor, or some guy getting a very realistic-looking weapon and pulling it out or doing something with it in a very very bad place. So we began using airsoft weapons originally in Cthulhu Live, again just as very realistic-looking physical props. I began to then get into airsoft as a hobby, and so I won't go too much into what we do on too many levels with Mind Game Productions, just simply since it's going a little off track of what the question is or the game is. But just wanted to suffice to say that one of the things that we do with our events company is even the larger field games that we do that are airsoft based, we've kind of been known to bring in a lot of LARP type elements that you don't necessarily see with other event organizers. There's a phenomenal system out by a gentleman who lives in North Carolina right now called Nathan Frund, and he basically wrote what it's called Firefight, and essentially it is a LARP for airsoft. It's a set of character classes, skill sets, challenges, and tests that can basically bring a airsoft game to a much more, in some ways, much more realistic level, because you're actually having to force the players to rely on skill sets, rely on equipment they either do or don't have, making key decisions, and a certain amount of random chance. It's a great game. We've always used a portion of the Firefight system, because many of our events, Firefight is really an ideal game for maybe 15 to 30 participants, I would say, is like a really good number for that. A lot of our Mind Game Productions events sometime are 150, 200. We've had a 400-person event before as well at a military training site. So the scale of those is prohibitive for using the full Firefight system. But we've utilized a fantastic medic deck they use for determining player wounds in the field. It includes role-playing elements. So, for example, if a person's been shot on the field, a medic will come to them. They'll utilize this deck. And there may be elements in there they're going to be role-playing out. For example, shattered jaw, and they can't talk. Or limbs are disabled, and they're having to act it out in the rest of the scenario. Now, we've done games based on a couple of popular computer games, Fallout, Stalker. which have had a lot more interaction between factions, where players tend to also be doing a lot more negotiating, a lot more waving white flags, coming at each other, wheeling and dealing. We've introduced currency systems in some of those games, be it fake rubles or bottle caps, and players are having to do jobs, earn money, buy items on the field, and it's injecting a much more of a LARP element into even some of our bigger airsoft games than one typically sees with many airsoft event organizers.
Pretty cool. And you've actually done some pretty cool things. I mean, for that 400-person game you mentioned, or for some of those that you've done, you actually have brought in active duty Army colonels to lead the two different 200-person sides in the field, haven't you?
Yeah, we've had a couple of Army colonels. We had a great fellow who was a former Russian Spetsnaz who was commanding one of our Op 4 forces at one time. We've had and also some of those events too. We'll bring in, of course, vehicles, some of the site pyrotechnic effects, and a lot of really cool stuff for those level of events. So
Mind Game Productions is going way beyond what a lot of comparable companies are actually doing with their events, isn't it?
To a degree, yeah. I mean, there are some other event companies out there and some really good ones. We've actually been pretty fortunate that I think we're probably the longest running and probably the largest airsoft events company on the East Coast at this point.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
And Mac, you did something kind of cool here recently, where you were working with National Guard, police officers, CDC doctors at a contagion zombie slaying event down in Florida. Can you tell us a little about what you did there and what your group was involved in?
Yeah, well, there are a couple other things that Mind Game Productions has kind of gotten involved with besides just the airsoft events. We've done some pretty serious training courses, tactical training classes for fellows that really wanted to up their skill levels in that area. We've done some work with training support. There was an event we did with Flagler County. They were doing a large-scale EMS competition, and we were providing a number of actors and roles of military troops for a simulated crisis situation where it was an endurance-based test for the various EMS teams, and we were there to add realism and stress to it, and cause a lot of chaos, get in their way, kick their equipment around while we were running around inside the medical tent, and just add a lot of stress to the situation. We've had the chance to do some work with actually we were very fortunate. We had a chance to do some work with a commercial film supposed to be coming out in November. It's a Rockabilly Zombie Weekend. We provided the military team for Rockabilly Zombie Weekend and a little bit of military consulting on the checkpoint and some of the processing of some of the infected personnel and how they would be handled through the checkpoint. We've done a few other opportunities like that. Now, going into what you're talking about with this Contagion Zombie event, we've also, for a number of years, been involved in convention events at science fiction conventions, fantasy conventions, and specialty conventions. They were kind of a fusion of airsoft and, well, a light version of airsoft and a light version of LARPing. Some of those have been science fiction themed. The Space Marines, I know that we'll be talking about at some point. What we did recently at Fort Myers, there was a big zombie convention, ZombieCon, down at Fort Myers, and we were putting together kind of a zombie survival escape scenario where teams of players would be going from station to station, interacting with our staff, being assaulted by zombies, and peppering them with pellets. It was fun stuff.
It sounds like it's one of those things that is no longer just a fantasy, that you're now part of reality. You're working with people to make them better, and that's pretty neat in my estimation. But you mentioned the Space Marines, so let's move on and talk about Interplanetary for a minute. Interplanetary is a game that Skirmisher Publishing has been working on for a while. I've recently taken over as the lead on the project. Of course, Mac, a lot of your work comes from, or a lot of the stuff that I have comes from your work. So it's you're pretty important into the process of creating this game. Can you talk just a moment about what Interplanetary is, the type of role-playing game it's trying to be, and then
Sure.
we'll talk more about the history of the world and such.
Interplanetary is a role-playing game that Skirmisher's in the process of putting together. I'm really excited to see it. It's an outgrowth of one of the convention events that I discussed. We had been for a number of years starting to do this science fiction themed event with a United States Marine Space Corps, kind of a fictional Space Marine unit. What we elected to do at those events is we elected to come up with our own unit rather than just, ripping off the Colonial Marines or a pre-existing intellectual property. We decided to create our own. There were a couple of tie-ins we did with it. Skirmisher also put together a really nice Space Marine field manual that we had released back at the very beginning with us. And I'm sure Mike can put a little plug in on that. It's continued to evolve over the years. It's been a successful event at conventions, and we began to expand on the concept a little bit further to include the vision of a Pathfinder, I believe Pathfinder system role-playing engine for it, and also a miniatures-based game, which is probably a little bit further in development right now than the role-playing game. And because we began, over the years, we began to flesh out the backstory of the universe so much more for these events. And we began to realize, hey, we've kind of got some cool ideas here, let's continue to develop it further. And the fact that it was sort of integrated into a live-action experience, a traditional tabletop game, a miniatures game, we thought it was actually really kind of a unique system in that regard.
And a preview of the miniatures game, a playable preview of the miniatures game, is going to appear in the full version of D Infinity Volume 4. So there's a preview of D Infinity Volume 4, Dark Future is its theme, and that's up on Drive-Thru-RPG right now. If anyone buys that right now, they won't get the miniatures game, but when we release the full version, anyone who's already bought the preview version will get a free download of the full version. So if you pick up that D Infinity Volume 4 right now, you will in fact get a copy of the interplanetary U.S. Marine Space Corps miniatures rules that Matt created.
Right, and I've looked over those rules, and they're very interesting. I'm looking forward to play testing. But one of the things that I like about Interplanetary is the history behind it, because it's not just it's not just a small part of it. It's a huge chunk of what I think makes Interplanetary great, and what makes really any sort of a futuristic type game interesting. But I love how it connects things like the Gulf War and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan to like future actions by the Muslim and Islamic worlds, and I think that it's so interestingly detailed. Is this something that you intended, Mac, to have such a detailed world to play from?
It really did start to snowball pretty quickly. The original field manual that we showed earlier on was written by one of the co-founders of the whole Marine concept, Oliver Cass. And he already, from the very beginning, he began to write a pretty detailed backstory, which he began to continue to develop more and more, to begin to detail actions of other countries, histories of other countries. The interplanetary setting, what we were trying to do with the interplanetary setting is to come up with a reasonably near future setting, I mean as in maybe 200 years into the future, but to a point where the technology is still kind of gritty. There's still, the energy weapons are beginning to be introduced, but it's not, there's really not that space opera element. It's still, there's still a lot of very recognizable things.
No blaster pistols.
No blaster pistols. A lot of the warfare and the technology is still very, again, just a few steps away from where we are now. We also try to focus on creating a setting which begin to explore space colonization, where a lot of the political struggles on Earth are now just basically being transported off worlds. So you have a lot of political friction between certain political situations that are seen currently. There are some new alliances that are different in the future. Some things have changed radically. Some things haven't changed that much. But we've basically tried to build the model of again, basically Earth powers beginning a colonization, but there's still a lot of, well, for example, it's kind of a Cold War setting with China. We kind of took some inspiration of the U.S.-Russia Cold War. You have a lot of political tension with China, a lot of espionage behind the scenes. You have proxy wars that are being fought on some of the colonies, not necessarily directly by U.S. and Chinese forces, but maybe by...
Which are great for adventures. That's great for player character-oriented adventures, where the characters are part of these sort of low-intensity kind of black operations.
Right, and actually that's a really good point, Mike. Actually, that was triggered something that I think is definitely worth saying. One of the things that we also were working on the concept of interplanetary. While the interplanetary structure is derived from these events that were heavily military-based, the Space Marine concept, these military teams going in and shooting things. But what we wanted to make sure with Interplanetary, the role-playing game, is it's going much more than just military actions. I mean, there are a number of military-based role-playing games out there. Some of you have played some of them. I know, Mike, you remember Recon and some of those old classics.
Yeah.
And the only thing is, I always found with a lot of role-playing games that were solely military-based, you kind of hit a wall pretty quickly. After a while, you just sort of run out of options because you're in a unit. You don't exactly have a certain amount of... You have somewhat limited choices in what you can make.
Right.
So we wanted to make sure the interplanetary setting was heavily derived from the universe that we began to develop, supporting the Space Marine concept.
Mm-hmm.
By no means is it meant to be a military role-playing game, the tabletop version. There's going to be all kinds of different character options, again, ranging from settlers, smugglers, pirates, agents. There's all kinds of... It just adventurers, all kinds of things that can be set up. Just in that setting.
And even your military characters, my preference would be, and obviously people will have their own options, but my preference would be, even your military characters are reservists who get brought back into uniform for a couple of adventures, and then they go back to whatever they normally do and get to play adventures where they have a little more latitude in what they do. But yeah, have composite units where you've got, where the fighter type in the group is in fact a U.S. Marine who is on some kind of a mission, but everybody else are technicians or medics or smugglers or other people who've been brought on as informal assets or secret assets to help accomplish a mission.
Yep.
Yeah, and I'm real happy to be working on this project. Mac and I talked pretty extensively about it, and I think this is going to be a definite feather in my cap to be able to put this together. But I want to move on. We've got about 15 minutes left on our show. Just want to remind everybody that on our Drive-Thru RPG store, we have a sale running through Halloween on our Cthulhu Live 3rd Edition.
On Max Cthulhu Live 3rd Edition.
Exactly right, Max Cthulhu Live 3rd Edition. We are going to have 25% off all of our Cthulhu Live material. So you can check us out on Drive-Thru RPG. Just search for Skirmisher Publishing. Also, anyone watching this, if you will and you would like a copy of Cthulhu Live 3rd Edition and Muertes al Chupacabras, the script, which Mike is holding up right now, if you would like a physical copy of that sent to your home address, please send us an email, dinfinitylive@gmail.com, or you can tweet us at dinfinitylive, and we're going to choose one person at random. Next week's show, we'll announce it in our introduction. So just remember dinfinitylive@gmail.com or tweet us at dinfinitylive.
Is that one word or hyphenated?
It's all one word, dinfinitylive.
No hyphens?
No hyphens. So we did have a question from our audience last week. Going to take a minute each here and talk about it. The question comes from Eric, and it's, what is the longest game you have ever played? And I want to start with Richard. Richard, what is the longest game you've ever played?
Wow. I would say when I was in high school, maybe junior high. Most of around that time. The whole thing you do in the summer because you got nothing else to do, run a 24-hour game. I mean, that was pretty much it. And it was just like, we're going to play till we drop. And so it came in maybe a little over 24 hours before we just crashed and kind of got up and picked up a little bit right, where we left off after everybody woke up. But, I mean, it wasn't much longer after that. So I think I would have to say 24 hours is about the longest I've ever gamed, and I don't think I'll ever do that long again.
Yeah, that's probably about the longest that I have too. Although it was spread out over 2 different games. I played Magic the Gathering semi-professionally for a while, so we would meet up on Friday night and play Magic the Gathering until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and then start playing Advanced Civilization, which is like a 12-hour game. So so it's probably been about 24 hours. But I kind of looked at the question another way too, and what's the longest game you've played? And I was thinking about that, and I play, when we're talking about actual length of a game, and I played an OGL and then later Pathfinder game since 2004. So, you look at it a different way. That's 8 years that I've been playing. But Mike, what's the longest game that you've played?
Well, I'll give 2 answers to that in the spirit of the way you gave your answers.
Mm-hmm.
I've played any number of 24-hour games over the years. But I think the first 24-hour game I ever played, and Mac, if you know better, you can correct me on some of this. I think the first 24-hour game I ever played was summer of 1984. That was like the month after I graduated from high school. I was back visiting my parents in Munich, and I think Mac was playing in a D&D game that I was running. It would have been Mac and my brother and a couple of other people. I don't remember the others. And we ran a 24-hour game at my parents' dining room table at our apartment in Munich. And I think we started at about 11 a.m. With this game. And we just played through all day and then all night. And I remember, at some point my mom went to bed, and we're sitting around the table, and she gets up and she shambles out into the kitchen. She looks over at us and she says, you guys sure started playing again early. And then she just kind of looks, and she got so mad. She said, you've been up all night playing this stupid game? So we played straight through 20. Were you part of that, Mac? Were you in that game?
That sounds pretty familiar. Yeah.
All right. I thought you would have been in any event. And my brother had a sense of humor. It was fun back in those days, so he probably would have been part of that as well. So that was the longest game I played. The longest campaign that I've played has been since 2002, right up to this day. When we launched Skirmisher Publishing in 2002, we started developing what we called the Thera campaign setting. Today we call it the Coast campaign setting, or the Swords of Coast campaign setting. And just 2 months ago, we held a Kickstarter to raise the funds to publish the biggest, most lavish book we've ever published. And that book is coming out in May of 2013, and it will be the Swords of Coast fantasy campaign setting. So I've been running games in the Thera/Coast campaign setting for 10 years now. That might not be a world record, but it's pretty damn good. There's a lot of game companies that haven't lasted 10 years in this environment. And we've actually had characters continuously involved. A lot of times different players were playing those characters. Our Bard Desdenova is one of our archetypal characters. He's one of our key characters. Mac's smiling because he knows that's our Agent of Fortune. He's the character that can step in and shake things up in a campaign. But he's been played by a half dozen different people over the last 10 years. So that's the longest game I've ever played in terms of a ongoing game, which is to say our Coast campaign.
So it seems like the general consensus is 24 hours. I'm assuming you've done that as well, Mac?
Yeah, I don't know that I've done much more than 24, but yeah, I think back in Munich in high school and a couple times in college, I don't think anything longer than 24 in terms of like one stretch.
Right.
And yeah, unfortunately, really can't hit some of you guys with the campaign. We probably had maybe I've had a couple campaigns in college that maybe were about 3 years, but yeah, nothing quite like the 8 years, 10 years campaigns.
Yeah, and I got started when I was working for Wizards of the Coast. That was right when 3.5 was coming out. It was a big deal. So, I was able to get in on the ground floor on that. So we have one more segment tonight. We're going to talk a little bit about horror in games and how to make your games spiced up a little bit. And I'm going to go ahead and start and talk about my favorite thing to do when I want to add a little fear element is to use combat as a very descriptive element, like in a slasher movie. When you think about great slasher movies like Nightmare on Elm Street or the Michael Myers series, Halloween, you always remember these great kill scenes from the movies, and I think that's a very important thing to use. So if I'm having a character who's fighting a kobold with a dagger, I might say, the character stabs him in the eye and his brains ooze out the side. Something horrible or terrible. One of my favorite things to use in my last Pathfinder game was to have the whatever monster's blood and gore and ick all over him, and I had one of my characters who was very much squeamish about that sort of thing. So I was able to use that to get her goat from time to time. But there are also other types of elements, Hitchcockian elements that you can use. Mike, what do you use in your games to add a horror element?
Well, throwing in that sort of horrific kind of gore, if you don't do it all the time, can be effective. So we ran, and you got to do it on the fly. You can't plan for it. But we ran a scenario where a party was fighting a band of orcs and a giant. And the half-orc barbarian, the guy who was playing him, one of our players named Dave Thomas, he knew how to roll a 20 either for the first roll of an encounter or the last roll of an encounter. But the party's getting their butt kicked. They're fighting this giant. His barbarian half-orc is using a double-handed axe, and he gets a critical hit. And in short, he does 51 points of damage with an axe blow. Triple damage, 17 points times 3 to this giant who had like 40 hit points left. So I had him eviscerate the giant, get buried under the giant's entrails, and then have to do skill checks to get out from under the giant's entrails while the rest of the party was still struggling to fight the orcs. And I managed to do it where it wasn't funny, where it really was a very horrific scene because they didn't see it coming at all. So that's one way to do it. But it's a trick. Going back to the 24-hour game, little sleep deprivation doesn't hurt one bit with these things because fear is a visceral reaction. We don't get scared because we want to be scared. We don't react to fear because we've decided to react in a certain way to it. We're genuinely scared. We sort of lose control of how we react to things. And I've dealt with players who just wanted to be real deadpan and say, well, I'm not scared. I'm not going to be scared. We know players like that, right, Mac? Do we know any players by the name of Boner who would act that way in a game? We do. So you got to sort of play your characters in a sense. As the DM, you really just got to sort of ramp up this sense of apprehension. And I don't think it can be done in a real formulaic way. I think you just have to have a good connection with your players and get to know them and get to know what they'll respond to. And really, you're building a dramatic crescendo with them. We got to keep in mind, role-playing is ad hoc theater, especially with LARPs, but to a large extent with tabletop. It's ad hoc theater is what it is. So I think using drama rather than some specific kind of method is really what you want to do if you want to build that sense of horror. It's a function of storytelling more than a function of anything else, I would say.
And Richard, we were talking the other day about how it's hard to keep a horror mindset for a period of time, that it sometimes falls into humor. How would you keep a horror mindset up for a long period of time, or can you even?
Well, I don't know if you can or not, because I mean, like Mike said, it's a state of fear, and like that flight or flight mechanism kicks in, and sitting around a game table, you're really not going to have that happen so much. It's one of those things. It's like not something that's really feasible for long term, gameplay. Partially because it's tiring. It's extremely taxing on the body to try to ramp up that much fear. And I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of people have this tendency to look at the situation and just start laughing. It turns into a joke.
Which you don't want, really. I don't
right.
think.
And and I think it's more of a coping mechanism than anything else, because they know it's just a game, but also at the same time it's a way to relieve the tension from all of the stuff that's happening in the story. And so what I've actually tried to strive for more than anything else in the games that I play, for storylines, is to try to build in as much suspense as possible by using time locks. A time lock being essentially something that says, like, regardless of what you do, if you don't meet the deadline and be in that location at that specific time, whatever the event is, it still triggers even if you're not there. And then throw up a bunch of obstacles so the players feel like time is their enemy. So they're fighting as much against time and space as they are whatever's in their way. So that bureaucrat that you have to go through in order to get to the next step, or to be able to see the king to keep him from being assassinated or whether, that becomes the challenge. And so you can't just like pull out your sword, kill the guard, and move on.
There's a volcano that's going to go off whether you get off the island or not.
Exactly. And so those kind of stories I think are more feasible. And to use an anecdote of something that happened in one of my own campaigns is I try to set it up to like instill fear of animals from the very get-go. And I used some wolves, but wolves are naturally afraid of fire and people. So I tried to build in the tension, but my players kind of figured out that there was a certain point where they could keep the wolves at bay. And since I was trying to keep it as realistic as possible, it was like, well, great, there goes that. So they're no longer afraid of wolves. And then there was an encounter where they had to face a warg, a goblin rider on a warg, and he was supposed to get away. And my friend Eric, and okay, all these characters are first level. He's playing a first level swashbuckler, and he rolls a crit.
Of course.
Oh, it was like all I could do was just stare at the dice, and like so it was more horror for me than it was for them, because it's like the storyline, which was supposed to have this guy getting away so he could warn a larger invasion force that like there's people sneaking around and trying to uncover what's going on. Well, that doesn't happen, and so I'm sitting there going, what do I do now? And he rolls the dice and does more than 50% damage to the warg. So here you have a 3 CR creature against a first level character who got lucky, and it dies of system shock.
Great.
So, and the dice are in front of everybody, so it's not like I can say, no, that doesn't happen. Right?
I always roll my dice in secret, man. I maintain
Right.
iron-fisted control over my game.
But
And-
so that's why I think you can't really do it feasibly for long-term horror. It's not really something you can maintain.
But
You
Mac,
have to do it in fits and
Mac's
starts.
done a lot of that. I mean, Mac, you were running horror tabletop games 30 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, as far as tabletop goes, you're right. It's description. I think also keeping the lights dim. You're right about sleep deprivation. A lot of the tabletop things that you use for a tabletop horror game are very similar to some of the things you do in fantasy. There was one thing as we were talking about this that I just did want to mention because it's, I think, one of the phenomenal example of a truly horrifying game. Probably one of the scariest Cthulhu Live games in my opinion has ever been written. Sorry he couldn't join us tonight, but Will Thrasher developed a script for Cthulhu Live, which I still feel is one of the most brilliant Cthulhu Live scripts.
Sight unseen.
Sight unseen. One, I love it because it's actually designed for a very small team of players, which is sometimes challenging. It can be run with about maybe four-player characters and maybe 2 staff members. It can be run that small. What's really distinctive about Sight Unseen is that the players are all checking into a hospital for different afflictions. when they come out of surgery, they find that all of their eyes have been removed, surgically removed. And basically, they play the entire game completely blindfolded. You completely remove their sight from the game. Complete sensory deprivation there.
The players have apprehension.
And so of course during the game there's a lot of physical sensations, touching effects. I mean, some of them are kind of like haunted house effects, but very clammy, very awful feeling things. You realize, oh my God, this is supposed to be an organ that I'm feeling, and it's not really an organ, but since you can't see it, you're relying on smell, on sounds, on feeling alone. It
might be an organ. You just don't know.
No, it's a terrifying game, and and even more so. Another great trick with that is if you have access to them for costumes and the players are okay doing it. If you can actually get the players to just wear shorts and throw them in hospital gowns, then you also have that sense of vulnerability because you feel half naked. You feel like you're blind. You feel like you're half naked wearing this light hospital gown, shorts underneath. But that particular script, I think, is one of the best and one of the scariest Cthulhu Live scripts written because of that sensory deprivation element, all the sound tricks, all the sensation, the sense of touch tricks that are used in it. It's a terrifying game.
Yeah, good. That's all good.
Yep, and you can get Sight Unseen on our Skirmisher store on DriveThruRPG,
right.
25% off right now, just to give another plug. But we are running out of time, gentlemen, so we're going to do the last word for this episode. Don't forget that you can pick us up 2 weeks from today. We'll be live here on YouTube. We don't know who we're going to have on as a special guest, but make sure to check out our website. You can check out our Twitter as well, at dinfinity.com. So for the last word, let's start with Mac. Mac, what is your last word for the evening?
I guess got to thank everybody that's still keeping with the old school games. I'll admit I love my computer games too, but definitely kudos to everybody that's still playing the classic games.
Awesome. And Mike, what's your last word for tonight?
My last word is that tomorrow, what is tomorrow's date? The 26th.
26th.
So the 26th through the 28th, I will be at Austin Comic Con in Austin, Texas. We're not exhibiting or running any events there. This is just a scouting expedition for Skirmisher and D-Infinity. So I'll be up at Austin Comic Con meeting with writers, other publishers, artists. If anyone listening wants to meet with me and talk shop, then that's what I'm there for. I suspect I'll be seeing Daniel Burrows of Crack Monocle, one of our former guests who lives in Austin. I assume he'll be there and probably paying some bizarre, god-awful, extortive price to have a booth there, so I'll stop by and visit him there. But I'll be at Austin Comic Con, so I'll have a black Skirmisher shirt and my trademark black beret. Track me down and let's talk.
All right, and Richard, what is your last word for this episode?
Well, I got some stuff in the works for Skirmisher. Yes, and I'm hoping to have another blog piece released soon on alignments, and keeping with the horror theme, it's looking at kind of an evil take on lawful good, or something that can very well become sinister if it played the right way.
Well, awesome. We'll look forward to that. My last word for tonight is to thank Mac McLaughlin. Thank you so much for being a part of the show. We're sorry that Will couldn't be here, but we're glad to have you on, and I'm looking forward to working with you on Interplanetary as soon as my novel Swords of Koz Eugenos is done, which I expect will be late November, early December. Awesome. So very much looking forward to that. So on behalf of Mac McLaughlin, on behalf of Michael Varhola, on behalf of Richard Balsley, and on behalf of the absent William Thrasher, I am Robert Griver. We thank you so much for joining us at D-Infinity on Twitter. Thank you very much, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye, y'all.
Thanks, guys.